The dawn broke over the shattered fields of France in the summer of 1944, a pale, smoky light filtering through the clouds and illuminating the twisted remnants of roads and villages scarred by relentless war. Colonel Hans Richter, a seasoned officer of the Wehrmacht, had spent months chasing shadows, listening to whispers of Allied movements, and now he stood at the threshold of a discovery that seemed almost unreal. A cache of fuel so massive, 50,000 gallons of it, hidden deep within an abandoned refinery just behind the lines, that even his experienced mind could scarcely comprehend the implications. The smell of gasoline and oil was thick in the air, sharp and almost intoxicating, and the faint hiss of leaking tanks echoed like ghostly voices telling him a story of both triumph and impending doom. For in that moment, surrounded by crates, barrels, and gleaming pipelines, Richter's mind raced with possibilities, imagining how this treasure could be harnessed to refuel his armored divisions, restore mobility to exhausted supply lines, and perhaps even turn the tide of a war that had already begun to slip from Germany's grasp. Yet as he ran his hands over the cold steel, feeling the weight of history vibrating through the pipes, a cold realization began to settle like frost on his spine. No matter how much fuel he captured, the war itself was already beyond saving. The Allies had advanced with precision, overwhelming numbers, and unrelenting logistics that had already strangled the Reich's capacity to respond effectively. And while a single man might seize tanks, trucks, and planes for one fleeting advantage, the scale of defeat had already been written in blood, iron, and the vast moving machinery of industrial warfare. Every barrel he inspected seemed both a gift and a curse, shimmering under the morning sun with a deceptive promise of power, yet whispering a terrifying truth that Reichsfuhrer decisions, Hitler's stubbornness, and the relentless Allied production had already sealed Germany's fate. And Richter could not help but feel an almost superstitious awe at the irony that in capturing the very lifeblood of mobility for his nation, he was confronted with the undeniable proof that it was too late, that no quantity of fuel could compensate for lost time, depleted morale, and the overwhelming tide of the Allies pushing inexorably toward the heart of the fatherland. As he began organizing men to secure the facility, map pipelines, and ration the precious resource, every step echoed with the knowledge that history was watching, that the ground itself bore witness to the futility of his efforts, and that the gleaming sea of oil was both a beacon of hope and a monument to the impossible, a liquid testament to the war's cruel geometry where advantage had been squandered. And even a fortune of 50,000 gallons could not alter destiny. He imagined the tanks rolling along the devastated highways, the engines roaring, the trucks loaded with ammunition and supplies, all fueled by this captured treasure. Yet he could also see the American forces advancing in waves, the bombing raids, the precision strikes cutting off routes and choking operations, and the stark contrast made him shiver, a cold premonition threading through the heat of exertion and the smell of gasoline. Men moved about the facility, carrying drums, checking gauges, securing pipelines, unaware of the full weight of what this moment represented. And Richter watched them, understanding that this operation, no matter how expertly executed, was a temporary defiance against the inevitable. A defiance that would ultimately be swept away by the overwhelming machinery of history. The morning passed into noon, and sun reflected off the polished steel barrels, glinting like a treasure in a tale of ancient kings. Yet Richter's mind was already calculating losses, supply consumption rates, fuel efficiency, and the impossible demands that lay ahead. He scribbled notes feverishly, aware that every calculation was an attempt to cheat fate, to wrest control from forces far larger than any man or regiment. And as the shadows lengthened across the abandoned refinery, a whisper of wind carried the scent of oil and the distant rumble of Allied armor moving closer. A reminder that even the most meticulous planning could not counteract the inevitable tide. In that moment, standing amid the gleaming barrels, the pipelines, the humming machinery, Richter understood a truth that no man wants to face, that power without time is useless, that preparation cannot outrun inevitability, and that the very resource he had fought to seize, the lifeblood of armies and machines, was impotent against the tide of a war already lost. And as the sun sank behind the horizon, Casting long shadows over the refinery, a quiet dread settled over him, a chilling awareness that 50,000 gallons of fuel, though captured with precision and courage, was nothing more than a fleeting symbol of defiance against a force of history too great to resist, and that in this glittering cache of liquid gold lay the undeniable proof that Germany's fate had already been sealed. That victory had slipped through the grasp of even the most resourceful officers, and that the war's outcome was now written not in strategy or courage, but in the unyielding momentum of overwhelming Allied might, industrial capacity, and the inexorable flow of time itself. The night descended with a heavy stillness, and Richter, staring at the steel drums reflecting the dying light, felt the weight of both his duty and his nation pressing down. The knowledge that he had captured a treasure too late, that he had secured the means of movement. Yet the end was inevitable, and in that realization, the full scope of defeat spread before him like an unrolling map of tragedy. Each barrel of fuel a silent witness to a moment of brilliant effort ultimately swallowed by the relentless advance of history. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the ruined landscape, curling around shattered trees and the jagged edges of bombed-out buildings as Colonel Hans Richter surveyed the captured fuel depot, his eyes narrowing against the damp chill and the smell of oil that hung heavy in the air like a ghost of past battles. Every barrel seemed to gleam with both promise and peril, a metallic ocean of possibility that could supply a regiment or perhaps a division, yet weighed down by the crushing awareness that no quantity of fuel could reverse the strategic collapse that Germany faced in the summer of '44. For as the Allies advanced relentlessly across France, the Wehrmacht's infrastructure crumbled under bombardment, sabotage and overstretched supply lines, and even this enormous capture of 50,000 gallons, monumental in any ordinary campaign, was merely a fleeting gesture in the face of an enemy whose logistical superiority was both terrifying and absolute. Richter moved among the barrels, tapping them with a gloved hand, feeling the vibrations of distant artillery in the earth beneath his boots, listening to the low murmur of men organizing the stockpiles, aware that each motion, each plan, was an attempt to wrest order from chaos, a defiance of inevitability. Yet the air itself seemed heavy with foreboding, as though the earth had already judged the outcome of the war, and his efforts, however meticulous, could do nothing to sway the immutable flow of history. As the first trucks were loaded and engines rumbled to life, the colonel noted with a grim satisfaction that the operation was proceeding efficiently. The men working with discipline and precision that belied the despair quietly threading through their ranks. But even as he mapped out routes, calculated consumption rates, and envisioned armored columns moving once again with renewed vigor, a cold dread settled in the pit of his stomach. For he knew the Allies' advance was relentless, their air superiority complete, and their capacity to intercept, bomb, and annihilate any movement of fuel or troops was unmatched, making this logistical triumph a cruel illusion, a temporary mirage in a desert of strategic doom. The barrels gleamed under the growing sun, reflecting a light that seemed almost mocking, a brilliance that contrasted sharply with the shadow of inevitable defeat. And Richter felt the weight of history pressing upon him, an oppressive reminder that courage and efficiency could not substitute for industrial might, production, and time, all of which were running out for the Reich. As he oversaw the loading of fuel onto trucks and armored carriers, he imagined the engines roaring along highways still dotted with rubble, the convoy snaking through towns scarred by war. Yet every image in his mind was tempered by the knowledge that Allied air reconnaissance, artillery, and mechanized forces could obliterate it in minutes, turning a triumph of German planning into a spectacle of futility. And the colonel shivered at the irony that the very liquid gold that symbolized hope was simultaneously a monument to what could never be achieved. Every measured movement of the men around him, the clinking of metal, the hiss of leaking valves, the faint odor of gasoline in the misty air, reinforced the paradox that in capturing and mobilizing this enormous cache, they were executing the perfect tactical operation at the perfect time for tactical effect, but utterly irrelevant in the strategic calculus that now dictated the collapse of Germany's Western Front. The colonel's mind raced, balancing calculations of fuel efficiency, distances, and vehicle performance with a creeping awareness of futility. And yet, duty and pride compelled him to proceed, to organize, to perfect the distribution network that could sustain operations only briefly, as if by sheer will the tide of history could be slowed, if not reversed. The sun climbed higher, scattering the mist, revealing the full scale of devastation across the countryside. Bomb craters, ruined villages, and scorched earth stretching into the horizon, and every detail reinforced the truth Richter had begun to feel in the depths of his bones, that while he could seize the lifeblood of armies, he could not seize time, nor undo the overwhelming momentum of Allied forces, nor repair the fractured morale of a nation already gasping under the weight of impending defeat. As trucks departed with their precious cargo, engines growling and tires kicking up dust from shattered roads, Richter followed them with his eyes, imagining the fleeting advantage this fuel would provide, the temporary revival of operations, and yet in the same moment envisioning Allied bombers appearing like grim specters, dropping destruction upon every convoy, turning the bright promise of liquid energy into a trail of fire and smoke. And he could not help but recognize that this was the cruel lesson embedded in the barrels themselves. Power without strategic positioning, resources without time, action without leverage, all meaningless against the inexorable advance of a superior force. The colonel paused on a ruined overpass, watching the distant horizon where enemy reconnaissance planes occasionally appeared, the clouds reflecting the sun and casting fleeting shadows over the landscape, and he felt the bitter weight of realization settling fully, that in this captured fuel there was both hope and proof of futility, a liquid symbol of human effort and ingenuity, rendered impotent by timing, scale, and the relentless pressures of modern warfare. As the convoy disappeared into the distance, he took a slow, deliberate breath, the smell of oil and gasoline sharp in his nostrils, and allowed himself a fleeting moment to appreciate the perfect coordination, the precise execution, and the discipline of his men, only to be struck again by the haunting truth that these measures, no matter how perfect, could not alter the course of history, and that the 50,000 gallons of captured Allied fuel, monumental as it was in isolation, could not counteract the structural collapse of the Wehrmacht, the crushing superiority of Allied forces, or the inexorable momentum of a war already lost. Night fell, shadows stretching across the fields and the refinery, and Colonel Richter, standing amid the emptying barrels, reflected on the bitter irony that he had succeeded gloriously in capturing the lifeblood of armies only to confront the unchangeable truth that success had come too late, that strategy had failed, and that the fate of Germany was now unavoidable, written not in the efforts of one man, but in the overwhelming flow of time, resources, and the unstoppable might of an enemy whose industrial and military power could not be matched, leaving him with the haunting, inescapable vision of a nation running on empty, doomed despite the brilliance, bravery, and fleeting triumph of those who tried to hold it together. The morning fog hung thick over the ruined roads and splintered fields, softening the edges of devastation, yet amplifying the ominous weight of the situation as Colonel Hans Richter surveyed the sprawling refinery, now secured and brimming with the captured 50,000 gallons of Allied fuel. Every barrel gleamed wetly under the pale sun, reflecting both the promise of renewed operations and the bitter irony of futility, for Richter's mind, trained in decades of command and strategy, could not escape the gnawing truth that the war itself had already slipped beyond the grasp of even the most disciplined officer. He moved among the barrels, boots crunching over gravel and debris, the smell of gasoline thick and cloying, aware that the liquid treasure he had seized symbolized both hope and impending doom, a paradox embodied in cold steel containers that, while capable of fueling armored columns and mechanized forces, could not undo the relentless tide of Allied advance crushing across France. As his staff worked tirelessly to map pipelines, secure valves, and coordinate truck convoys, Richter's eyes traced every shadow, every movement of men, vehicles, and distant reconnaissance planes, aware that the Allies' air supremacy could obliterate these efforts in minutes, reducing months of careful planning and daring seizure to ash and twisted metal. And yet he pressed on, compelled by duty, pride, and the desperate need to wrest meaning from a collapsing strategic landscape. The trucks rumbled to life, engines throbbing with mechanical urgency, carrying precious fuel over broken highways, scarred by shell craters, burned-out tanks, and shattered towns, each convoy a fleeting defiance against inevitability. Yet Richter could not shake the vision of enemy aircraft slicing through clouds, dropping destruction with deadly precision, turning liquid hope into fire and smoke, and haunting him with the knowledge that even perfect execution could not alter destiny. He walked along the edge of the depot, notebook in hand, making calculations of fuel efficiency, consumption rates, and potential operational reach, while his mind simultaneously traced the broader picture: the overstretched German supply lines, the exhausted troops, the relentless pressure of the Allies' industrial and logistical superiority, and the horrifying realization sank deeper. No amount of captured fuel could restore the momentum lost, nor could it repair the fractured morale, the logistical chaos, or the strategic collapse that was unfolding inexorably, silently, and with unrelenting force. The wind carried a faint scent of smoke and gasoline, mixing with the earthy decay of bombed-out villages, creating an olfactory tapestry of both possibility and foreboding. And each inhalation reminded Richter of the paradox of his triumph: a monumental tactical victory utterly irrelevant in the strategic calculus of a war already slipping away. The sun rose higher, casting sharp reflections off the barrels, illuminating every seam, every weld, every gleaming cylinder, as if mocking the futility of human effort against the relentless momentum of history. And Richter, standing among the perfectly executed seizure, understood that the Allies' overwhelming resources and production capacity had already written Germany's fate in iron, steel, and oil, and that this captured treasure was, in the grand scheme, no more than a fleeting ripple against a tidal wave of inevitability. The men under his command moved with precision, securing valves, labeling barrels, and loading trucks, their disciplined coordination a testament to skill and training. Yet each movement carried the echoing weight of futility, for all their efforts, all their planning, could not halt the inexorable collapse that surrounded them, and Richter felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach as he imagined the Allied forces, vast, unrelenting, and impossibly coordinated, advancing, pressing the pace, neutralizing every advantage, and rendering his heroic seizure of 50,000 gallons a brilliant but ultimately irrelevant gesture. As the convoys departed, engines growling and dust rising from broken roads, Richter followed them with his eyes, calculating potential distances, fuel consumption, and operational reach, juxtaposed with the unyielding, advancing shadows of Allied columns and aircraft, and the knowledge that his triumph, though tactically perfect, could not change the strategic reality pressed upon him like the oppressive summer air. The afternoon sun glinted off metallic surfaces, highlighting the irony that the very resource meant to restore mobility and sustain operations was powerless against the overwhelming force, organizational depth, and unassailable momentum of the enemy. And Richter understood that history had already adjudicated the outcome. Shadows lengthened across the refinery as the men finished securing pipelines, the last trucks departed, and silence fell, broken only by distant artillery and the hum of engines fading into the horizon. And in that silence, The colonel's mind traced every scenario, every calculation, every possible maneuver, only to confront the stark reality that 50,000 gallons, though a staggering fortune of fuel, could not reverse a tide that had already claimed victory for the Allies, and that all his skill, bravery, and tactical ingenuity were, in the grand scope of events, a mere footnote in the inexorable advance of history. As night descended, Richter stood alone amidst the abandoned depot, the barrels reflecting the cold light of the moon, and felt the crushing weight of inevitability that he had captured, organized and protected a treasure too late, and that in this monumental act of discipline and skill lay the irrefutable truth. Germany's fate was sealed, written in the advance of enemy forces, the collapse of infrastructure, and the unstoppable momentum of industrial and military might that no man, no officer, and no fortune of fuel could alter. The wind whispered through the pipes, carrying the faint scent of gasoline and lost opportunity, and Richter, standing amid the gleaming barrels under the cold gaze of the moon, understood fully the cruel lesson that history had inscribed. Even the most brilliant tactical victories are powerless against overwhelming strategic inevitability, and the 50,000 gallons, a monument to skill and daring, were nothing more than a fleeting shimmer of defiance against the immovable tide of destiny. The sun rose over the shattered countryside like a pale, reluctant witness, casting long, trembling shadows across bombed-out roads, scorched earth, and skeletal buildings, as Colonel Hans Richter rode slowly along the perimeter of the captured fuel depot, the 50,000 gallons of Allied fuel glinting under the morning light, each barrel a stark symbol of both opportunity and futility, reflecting the paradox of human effort in the face of inexorable history. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline, smoke, and damp earth, a pungent reminder of past battles and the lives lost on the surrounding terrain. And every inhalation pressed the weight of reality upon Richter's shoulders. For while this hall could sustain operations for days, even weeks, it could not change the fact that the Allied forces were advancing with overwhelming speed and industrial might, their logistical network flawless, their air superiority absolute, and their relentless pressure crushing the remnants of German resistance with mechanical inevitability. He dismounted from his staff car, boots crunching over gravel and shattered asphalt, and walked slowly among the barrels, running a gloved hand along the steel as if seeking reassurance from cold, inanimate objects, each one representing the fuel that could power tanks, trucks, and armored divisions, yet knowing in his heart that no quantity of fuel could compensate for the strategic collapse already unfolding across France, Belgium, and the Low Countries, nor the overwhelming disparity in manpower, resources, and air support that dictated the fate of the Reich. The convoy teams moved efficiently, loading the barrels onto trucks with a precision born of training and discipline, engines growling as the vehicles set out on treacherous, rubble-strewn roads, while the distant drone of Allied reconnaissance planes echoed faintly over the horizon, a grim reminder that each movement was observed, each shipment vulnerable to bombing, strafing, and destruction, transforming tactical brilliance into fleeting, fragile advantage. And yet Richter pressed on, compelled by duty, pride, and the unyielding resolve to extract every ounce of value from the monumental capture, even as the crushing reality of futility settled in deeper with every mile traveled, every turn calculated and every barrel counted. As the trucks snaked along broken highways, Richter envisioned the armored columns they could support, the fuel-enabling mechanized units to move with renewed speed, to strike at isolated enemy positions, to buy time, to resist, yet simultaneously, his mind raced through scenarios of Allied air attacks, ambushes, and the inevitable attrition that would reduce these operations to smoke and ash. And in the quiet moments, as engines hummed and dust rose behind the convoys, he felt the full weight of strategic inevitability pressing against every decision, every calculation, and every command, for in capturing such a vast resource, he had performed an act of tactical brilliance that could not, in itself, changed the immutable tide of the war. The landscape around the depot reflected the bitter irony of human endeavor. Villages reduced to rubble, forests scarred by artillery fire, and fields torn apart by bombs and tank tracks. every detail a reminder that even the best planned operations could not halt the relentless machinery of Allied advance, and that the captured fuel, though monumental in quantity and symbolic in significance, existed in a vacuum of strategic influence, a fleeting advantage dwarfed by the scope and scale of forces arrayed against them. Richter observed his men coordinating the shipments, calculating fuel consumption, mapping supply lines, and organizing convoy rotations, their faces a mixture of determination, anxiety, and grim awareness. And he recognized that every barrel moved, every truck dispatched was an act of discipline, courage, and human ingenuity performed against an enemy whose resources, planning, and coordination were unparalleled. And yet, for all the skill and care, it could not change the fundamental truth. Germany's fate had been decided by the overwhelming strategic superiority of the Allies, whose factories, manpower, and logistical networks rendered even the most extraordinary feats of tactical brilliance a mere flicker in the unfolding storm of history. As the day wore on, the sun climbing higher and scattering clouds across the sky, Richter stood atop a ruined overpass, observing the departure of the last convoy, engines echoing through valleys and bombed-out streets, dust clouds rising and dispersing like ghosts of battles past. And he felt an oppressive mix of pride and despair, knowing that the captured fuel would momentarily revive units, enable fleeting counterattacks, and sustain mechanized operations. Yet the broader truth remained inescapable. The Reich was running out of time, space, and options, and the Allies' inexorable advance would render even this monumental achievement ultimately irrelevant. As twilight approached, shadows lengthened across the depot, barrels glinting dimly in the fading light, and Richter reflected on the cruel lessons of his triumph, that human ingenuity, discipline, and tactical skill could achieve spectacular, almost heroic feats, yet remain powerless against the unrelenting momentum of history, the overwhelming capacity of a superior foe, and the collapse of strategic infrastructure. For 50,000 gallons of captured fuel, magnificent as it was, could not alter the eventual outcome of a war dictated by production, planning, and the sheer weight of industrial and military might. Night fell, cold and quiet. The distant rumble of artillery a faint whisper on the wind, and Richter, standing alone among the emptied roads and shadowed barrels, felt the crushing weight of inevitability settle fully over him, understanding that his daring, discipline, and careful orchestration had produced a triumph that was simultaneously brilliant, monumental, and tragically inconsequential. And as the moonlight reflected off the steel containers, glimmering like distant stars in the ruined landscape, he knew that history had passed judgment, that Germany's fate was sealed, and that all the skill, courage, and resourcefulness displayed in the capture and distribution of this fuel would exist only as a haunting testament to human effort in the face of unstoppable inevitability. The morning mist clung to the shattered forests and scarred fields like a ghostly shroud as Colonel Hans, Richter rode along the convoy route, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Allied reconnaissance or air attack, knowing that every barrel of captured fuel represented both opportunity and peril, and that the massive tactical victory of seizing 50,000 gallons could be obliterated in moments by a single well-coordinated strike from above. The trucks rumbled steadily, engines growling through the broken terrain, their cargo glinting with the faint sheen of gasoline in the weak sunlight. While Richter's mind traced the intricate calculus of supply lines, fuel consumption, armored unit reach, and operational timing, all juxtaposed against the ever-pressing weight of the Allied advance, whose industrial might and logistical superiority rendered even the most daring acts of German ingenuity a fleeting defiance against an inevitable outcome. As the convoy wound its way through craters, bombed-out villages, and shattered bridges, Richter reflected on the men under his command. Their disciplined coordination and mechanical skill a testament to training and dedication, yet he could not suppress the gnawing dread that these efforts, though flawless in execution, could not change the strategic reality that had been unfolding relentlessly for months. The inexorable advance of well-supplied, meticulously organized enemy forces whose momentum could not be halted by courage or captured resources alone. The air was heavy with the pungent scent of gasoline, oil, and smoke, a visceral reminder of both victory and vulnerability. and every mile traveled pressed the paradoxical weight of triumph and futility onto Richter's shoulders. As he realized that this monumental haul, a tactical marvel in scale and execution, existed in a vacuum of strategic influence, a brilliant but ultimately impotent ripple in the vast, unstoppable tide of Allied power sweeping across Europe. He paused briefly at a ruined bridge, watching as trucks strained over damaged beams, their wheels rattling and engines screaming against the uneven terrain. And the sight was both inspiring and terrifying, a tangible demonstration of skill, coordination, and perseverance, yet a stark reminder that even this flawless operation could be annihilated by airstrike, artillery, or mechanical failure, any one of which would render the entire enterprise meaningless. And Richter felt the heavy hand of inevitability tighten around his chest as he contemplated the broader picture. The vast resources, manpower, and industrial depth arrayed against them, and the harsh truth that 50,000 gallons, though staggering in magnitude, could not turn the tide of a war already lost. The convoy pressed onward, moving through fields scarred by shellfire, towns reduced to rubble and forests stripped bare by combat, the rhythmic drone of engines mingling with the distant rumble of artillery and the faint whistle of the wind over broken rooftops, creating a haunting symphony of war, destruction, and human endurance. And Richter's mind traced every variable, every contingency, every potential disaster, calculating outcomes that were, in reality, powerless against the immutable momentum of history. As the sun climbed higher, casting sharp reflections off the barrels of fuel, Richter's mind flickered to the thousands of soldiers who might rely on this resource. Their lives, positions, and operations dependent on the careful orchestration he had executed. Yet he understood with crushing clarity that the Allies' superiority in numbers, strategy, and industrial capacity rendered all these calculations tragic, as the tactical gain could never reverse the strategic collapse unfolding inexorably before him. He observed the engineers and drivers working with precise coordination, mapping routes, checking valves, and calculating fuel burn rates. Their professionalism a testament to human skill and ingenuity. Yet each precise movement carried the haunting weight of futility, as every mile traveled could be observed, disrupted or destroyed by superior enemy forces. And Richter's heart sank under the weight of this realization, that even perfect execution could not alter the strategic reality, that all the courage, intelligence, and discipline poured into this operation were ultimately small and fragile against the vast, unyielding momentum of Allied power. The afternoon sun glinted off metallic surfaces, illuminating every seam, weld, and dent, highlighting the paradox of human endeavor. The beauty, precision, and ingenuity of the operation contrasted sharply with the inevitability of its ultimate irrelevance. And Richter understood that the captured fuel, though monumental in scale and symbolic in significance, was powerless to stop the tide of history. As twilight descended, long shadows stretched across bombed-out roads, fields, and forests, the rumble of departing trucks fading into the distance, leaving Richter standing among barrels, maps, and scattered equipment, the scent of gasoline and smoke hanging in the cool evening air, a sensory echo of both triumph and futility. And in that quiet, oppressive moment, he faced the final, unflinching truth. Germany's fate had been sealed long before these barrels were captured, and the heroic orchestration of a tactical masterstroke, brilliant in scale and execution, existed only as a haunting testament to human skill and perseverance in the face of inevitable collapse. As the last rays of sun reflected off the metallic surfaces, painting them with a ghostly golden glow, Richter felt the full weight of history pressing down, knowing that his tactical genius, discipline, and daring, though monumental, could not alter destiny, and that the 50,000 gallons, an achievement so grand in isolation, were ultimately a fragile, transient ripple in the relentless, unstoppable torrent of Allied supremacy. And as the wind whispered through the shattered trees and broken buildings, carrying the faint scent of gasoline and lost opportunity, he understood with haunting clarity that human ingenuity, courage, and tactical brilliance, no matter how monumental, are powerless against the immutable force of historical inevitability. The horizon burned with the orange glow of a setting sun, streaking through smoke and clouds over the shattered remnants of villages, forests, and bombed-out roads, as Colonel Hans Richter stood alone atop a ruined overpass, the 50,000 gallons of captured fuel now partially dispersed, trucked to distant depots, powering units that would fight briefly, valiantly, yet ultimately in vain. And as he watched the final convoy disappear into the distance, the wind carrying dust, gasoline vapor, and the faint echoes of distant artillery, a cold, inescapable truth settled over him. The tactical brilliance, the meticulous planning, the flawless execution of capturing such a massive resource, all of it was dwarfed by the overwhelming strategic superiority of the Allies, whose factories churned out planes, tanks, and trucks in numbers that made any single German triumph a fleeting shadow. And Richter felt the crushing weight of inevitability pressing down with every heartbeat. Every gust of wind, every flicker of light across the ruin-strewn landscape. For in that moment he understood fully, with the clarity of hindsight and the bitter sting of reality, that the war had already been decided, that no amount of fuel, no matter how vast, could reverse the inexorable collapse of a nation outmatched in resources, manpower, and industrial might. The trucks rumbled over broken asphalt, their engines humming against the shattered terrain, barrels rattling, each one a fleeting symbol of hope and human ingenuity. Yet Richter's eyes traced the distant horizon, calculating the relentless advance of Allied armored columns, the air patrols slicing through skies with mechanical precision, and the overwhelming logistical machinery that would consume any temporary advantage. And as he walked among the empty shells of ruined buildings and twisted metal, the smell of gasoline lingering in the air like a ghost, he reflected on the paradox of human endeavor, that courage, discipline, and brilliance could achieve feats of staggering scale, yet remain powerless against the sweeping tide of history, a lesson written in steel, fuel, and dust, whispered in the quiet hum of engines and the sigh of the wind over bombed fields. The shadows lengthened as twilight deepened, and Richter, silhouetted against the burning horizon, envisioned the brave crews, both his own and the enemy's, moving through the chaos, each step, each maneuver, each decision amplified by the unforgiving arithmetic of war. And he realized with haunting clarity that the 50,000 gallons captured in such a daring operation were not a turning point but a monument to the courage and ingenuity of men operating in the face of inevitable defeat, a fleeting triumph etched against the inexorable march of time and industrial might. The air grew colder, carrying the faint smell of smoke and burnt oil, and Richter felt history pressing down like a physical weight. The ghosts of those who had died in battles past, and those yet to fall hovering around the remnants of the convoy, reminding him that even extraordinary human skill cannot defy the structural forces of fate and power, and that the captured fuel, though monumental in scale and meticulously managed, existed only as a transient testament to valor and precision in a war already decided by numbers, production, and strategic inevitability. As night fell, the last light glimmered off steel barrels, reflecting stars like distant cold witnesses to human effort, and Richter, standing amid silence, dust, and shadow, understood that all of it, planning, courage, brilliance, risk, and reward, was dwarfed by the relentless momentum of history. And yet he also understood the importance of the record, the lesson, the story, the fact that human skill and daring, even in ultimate futility, leave traces that echo through time. The wind whispered through broken trees and hollowed buildings, carrying the faint scent of gasoline and memories of conflict. And Richter, looking out over the darkened landscape, felt the crushing weight of knowledge and experience converge in a single, stark truth. The war had been lost not through lack of courage or ingenuity, but through overwhelming disparity of resources and the unstoppable force of a superior adversary, and that this tactical triumph, magnificent and monumental, though powerless to change the outcome, would forever serve as a testament to human will, discipline, and daring, a final, haunting lesson from history written in fuel, steel, dust, and shadow, a reminder that even the greatest achievements can exist in the unyielding shadow of inevitability. And as the last stars reflected in the cold steel of empty barrels, Richter turned away, knowing that what he had accomplished would endure in memory even as the forces of history rolled onward, unstoppable, indifferent, and absolute.